Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the RealNext webinar series. Today we are talking about an introduction to comparative lease analysis, and thrilled to have as our special guest Dr. Jeffrey Fisher. I'm Jeff Finn, CEO at RealNext, and welcome. So Dr. Fisher, who is the head of research and data services for RealNext, is also the co-author of Real Estate Finance and Investments and Property Valuation. He's chairman of the Homer Hoyt Institute and professor emeritus of Indiana University's Kelley School of Business, an advisor to NACREIF and many other firms in the commercial real estate investment world. And Jeff, thrilled as always to have you with us today to talk about how do you use RealNext Market Edge to do comparative lease analysis? What are the inputs? What are the assumptions? How are the calculations implemented? What's the output to show the impacts of those leases, whether it's multiple locations that a tenant might be looking at, or from a landlord's perspective, multiple offers that they might be reviewing and negotiating to understand the balance sheet impact and the liability incurred on each of those transactions. Looking forward to you sharing with us how that's all put together. And as always, we're going to be open for Q&A along the way, and we will be recording the session and sharing it. Should be coming out to you tomorrow from the GoToWebinar platform. So Jeff, with that, I will let you take it away.
Thank you, Jeff. Let me just switch screens here. There we go. Okay. Should be able to see my screen.
You're good.
Yeah, we're doing a comparative lease analysis today. And so in RealNext, that's one of the modules. As you can see, I have circled on the left there, lease comparison and analysis. It's kind of related to the investment analysis, as I call it. It's right above that, presentation and property analysis. Of course, leases are a big part of doing the investment analysis, where we use the leases and project the income from those leases going forward, as well as what happens when you sell the property, and expenses, like we'll also talk about with the comparative lease analysis. And the difference is, we're looking at investing in a property, whereas with the comparative lease analysis, we're just focusing on the leases. And as we'll talk about here in a minute, actually this slide, we can look at it from two different perspectives. We can look at it from an owner rep analysis or from a tenant rep analysis. So when you first go into the program, you do have to decide, am I doing an owner rep? Am I doing a tenant rep? And then you select your property type. The inputs will be a little bit different depending on the property type. So you do select that up front, whether it's office, retail, or industrial is the three property sectors that are covered right now in the program. Of course, you could have other property types that are kind of similar that would still work. I guess the main thing is there isn't really a lease analysis for apartments. Probably don't really need one for apartments, at least the type of analysis that we're going to talk about today. So let's talk a little bit about the owner rep analysis. So some use cases that I've jotted down would be negotiating different lease structures for a new lease on a space in the building, or renegotiating an existing lease or evaluating a lease buyout. Especially during COVID, we're past that now, but although for other reasons, we may start to see a lot of lease buyouts and renegotiating of leases on existing space. So it's not just new leases that we're talking about. It could be an existing lease and the tenant wants to renegotiate, or they may be approaching you about a lease buyout, and you want to do an analysis to make sure it makes sense from the owner's perspective. We'll flip things around to looking at it from the tenant's perspective a little bit later. So from the owner's perspective, questions would be, how much does the lessor, the owner, receive on the lease? So you've got your base rent, you've got expense recoveries, and we're going to dig into that in some more detail. The idea there is, that a lot of times, as I'm sure most of you know, in leases, in addition to the base rent, you may be able to bill the tenant for some or all of the expenses, property taxes, insurance, maintenance, etc. And so that would be part of your rental income. Usually it's added right below the base rent in a lot of pro formas. And then there may be some tenant improvement allowances given to the lessee. So that would be a negative, right? That kind of reduces the effective rent that you end up getting on the property. May also be some moving allowances. During times when the market gets weak, what we tend to see is additional tenant improvements or additional moving allowances and other types of concessions, free rent and other things rather than changing the base rent. A lot of times what we see is just more concessions in some of these other areas. And then there could be lease buyouts that are received from the lessee is the last thing I have listed there. So I made a note at the bottom that sometimes when people do an analysis of the leases and they're calculating the effective rent, which we'll talk about more a little bit later, but they also subtract the expenses when they're comparing the different lease alternatives. So when I say subtracting the expenses, I mean the expenses that the owner then actually has to pay on the property. It's not clear to me that that really changes the answer in terms of comparing different leases, because if the owner has to pay the expenses, they've got to pay the expenses no matter what the leases are. The reimbursements may differ depending on the structure of the lease, but they still have to actually pay the expenses, whether they're reimbursed for them or not. And so I think in most cases, if it's the same building, I can't think of a reason why that would be different for different lease structures. So we don't subtract the expenses being paid by the owner in the program, but I have seen some other lease analysis programs that do subtract the expenses. If we're doing a tenant rep analysis, we have a little different set of use cases that we have listed here. This could be evaluating leases proposed for spaces in different buildings. So now we're analyzing leases that could be in different buildings, or it could be different spaces in the same building, or it could be different lease structures in the same space. It could be, comparing a gross lease with a net lease, or, different amounts of TI allowances, or, whatever. So, three really different, and there's probably other use cases that I don't have listed here, but again, it could be spaces in different buildings, could be the same building, but different spaces within the same building, or it could be the same space, but we're just looking at different ways of structuring the lease. And of course, you could have different ways of structuring the lease across the different spaces in different buildings. So now the question is, how much does the tenant have to pay? So he pays the base, or she pays the base rent, plus any expense recoveries that are going to be paid to the lessor, plus any expenses paid directly by the tenant. Like if the tenant has to pay some of the moving allowances, or the tenant has to pay some of the tenant improvements because it's not covered by reimbursements, plus any moving allowances that the tenant has to pay. Like if you're comparing staying in the same building with moving to a different building, you'd want to take the moving costs into consideration, because that's going to be part of your decision as to whether you move to a new building or stay in an existing building. And then less any moving allowances that you do receive from the lessor, because they're trying to entice you to move to a new building. As the market weakens, a lot of times Class A becomes affordable where it wasn't before for tenants that are in Class B buildings. And but in order to entice the tenant to move from the Class B to the Class A building, I have to provide some moving allowances. Then you have any tenant improvements that has to be paid out of pocket, less any TI allowances, and then less any lease buyout payments that you have to make to the lessor. So all those kind of things would be captured by the program. As I talked about before, we need to take into consideration whether we're able to pass through some of the expenses to the tenant. So everybody's familiar, I'm sure, with, you can have a gross lease where the owner has to pay, a net lease where the tenant has to pay, or typically I see something like you can maybe think of it as a gross lease, but you're able to pass through anything above a stop, which is a certain amount of expenses, oftentimes the first year expenses, with the idea that the owner pays the expenses the first year of the lease, whatever they are on a per square foot basis for that tenant space. But if the expenses go above what they are the first year, then they're passed through to the tenant to pay those increases in the expenses. There might also be a stop where we say, okay, we're going to pass through anything above $5 per square foot, let's say, but if it hits $10 per square foot, anything above that, the tenant again has to pay. So a lot of different ways these things can be structured. Probably the most complicated part of whether it's an investment analysis or comparative lease analysis is to try to capture all the different ways you could structure the expense reimbursements. And you got to specify for that for each expense a lot of times. So each one could be different in terms of how the reimbursements work. So you can also indicate how the expenses will change over time. In other words, whether there's step ups in the leases. You see in the bottom right here, in the example of a screenshot, you've got operating expenses of $5 per square foot per year. You see the little arrow that's a drop down, which means you can select other ways of specifying those expenses, whether it's a total annual amount or total monthly amount, amount per year, whatever. So in this case, it's $5 per square foot per year. There's no free rent in this case, but you could have some free rent for a certain time period. And then the recoveries, you've got a lot of different choices here. It could be a triple net lease, the 3 N's net, or it could be a base stop. And I'll have an example of that here in a minute. Usually I see that at least expressed on a per square foot basis. And then if there's a cap, like I talked about on what the pass-throughs would be, and that could also be on a per square foot basis, or there might be none for that particular expense category. Here you see the name operating expenses, which would be lumping all the expenses together in one category, but you'll see in a minute, you can break out those expenses into different categories, as you might typically do. Some key measures. And the lease analysis is fairly straightforward compared to investment analysis, where you might have a lot of different calculations and measures, whether it's your different multipliers and return calculations and present values and all that. We're basically interested in what the rent is, whether the owner is receiving it or the tenant is paying it. What's your total rent over the lease term, taking into consideration all the different things we talked about, which we might look at it on a per year or per month basis, or on a per square foot basis, and it could be per square foot of usable area or per square foot of rentable area. Difference, of course, being the rentable area would include a prorated portion of common area. So you're charging the tenant for prorated portion of common area that they're not actually able to use, but the rent is still based on that rentable area, which is, I think, pretty typical of most leases, at least that I've seen. And then I'm going to emphasize the importance of looking at a present value of the different lease alternatives that take into consideration the recoveries, the tenant improvements, any steps in the lease, moving allowances, all that stuff is captured in the present value. And then even more important or related to that would be to take another step and calculate what we call the net effective rent, which is as if all the lease payments were level every year. And it'd be level payments that have the same present value. I'll show you some examples of that here in a minute. Some people do a simple average of the rents, just add up all the rents and divide by the total number of years, which is kind of like using a zero discount rate. But rent payments up front count more than rent payments later on, time value, money, and all that. So really better to take the present value. It's not that more complicated, especially when the program does it for you, like the lease analysis does in Market Edge. So a simplified owner rep example, base rent is $20 per square foot per year in year one. It's going to increase 2% per year. 100,000 square feet of rentable area, same amount of usable area to keep it simple here. Lease starts in October of 2020. It's going to be 60-month, 5-year lease. We've got operating expenses starting in year one at $5 per square foot, but they're going to increase 2% per year. No free rent, but we could work that into the program. No tenant improvements. We're going to add that later on, see how that works. And then we're going to have recoveries that are based on a stop. We'll talk about that actually on a per square foot basis here in a minute, but for this tenant, it works out to be $500,000 in total for their first year expenses. So when we say base stop, the base is the first year, and anything above the first year expenses are what's going to be passed through to the tenant. So you see what the inputs would look like here. We've picked the base rent on the far left there. You can see we could pick the operating expenses, the taxes, the electric, the janitorial, HVAC, and then you see 3 there that we can rename. In fact, all these can be renamed. I think we probably encourage people to stick with the same names, or at least within your own systems. Use the same names here as you use within your CRM and other way you keep track of your data, so that that way you can interchange the data between different components within RealNex and you know, have benchmarks you can pull out of your CRM to see what, you know, what you see in some of these expense ratios and stuff on other leases. So you see the name here, base rent, again, which we could change. The amount is $20 per square foot per year. And we're going to have some escalations as shown on the right there in 2021, little older example, but basic idea, no matter when it starts, it's going to increase by 2%. Of course, this could be different every year, but we're maybe it's built into the lease that it's going to increase by 2% each year over the term of the lease. And it'd be the same basic idea for all these different categories, your operating expenses, your taxes. Sometimes the options for what you would input would differ a little bit depending on what you're choosing. Here you see the operating expenses. Again, we wouldn't have to have something that lumps all operating expenses together into one generic operating expense category. We could separate out taxes and electric and janitorial and however many we wanted. And you can see there's even furniture and voice data and improvements and association fees. And there's even more that you can't see here in terms of the things you could choose from, in addition to being able to create your own names. But you see the operating expenses here are $5 per square foot per year. And it's a base stop, again, based on $5 per square foot. This tenant has 100,000 square feet. So that's where we get the 500,000. I usually see the stop that it's based on a per square foot basis, depending on how much square feet that tenant has. And then again, you see your escalations. Of course, the expenses wouldn't have to be increasing the same rate as the base rent. Remember being on the board of a private REIT a number of years ago where, you know, they would show the expenses going up at a slower rate than the base rent was increasing. It's like, well, how are you going to do that? Of course, it could happen, but I think sometimes it was done to make the return look better. And they would say, well, we're better managers, so when we buy this property, we're gonna have rents increase at a faster rate than expenses are going to increase. Let's see, anything else here? I think that kind of covers that one. So this is what you would see when you do the calculations. In a simple example anyway, you've got your base rent projected out over, to keep it simple here, we just have a 5-year lease. And then you see your operating expenses. So 2020 was when the lease started. There's nothing there, but what would show up there is if you had some tenant improvements, as we'll see in a minute. But then the first year of the lease, you see operating expenses 0. And then you see 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, 41,000. So what's going on there? Now, I've already talked about it, but just a kind of reminder. So when we say, first of all, when we have operating expenses listed here, this is the reimbursements that we're talking about. It's not what the owner has to pay that comes out of their rent that they collect. This is what we're getting as a reimbursement from the tenant. And remember, it was the amount above the first year. So we went above the 500,000. Remember, we had a limit go back the right direction here. We had a stop of $5 per square foot or 500,000. So rents increased, or not rents, expenses increased above that. So the first year, the owner was covering them, but that increase now is being passed through. It works out to be $10,000 that we're able to pass through the tenant. And then that pretty much doubles, right? Even more than doubles the second year as the expenses are going up even more above the stop amount. So what would happen is on a new lease, of course, that could go back to zero again and start all over. But you know, that would be important in an investment analysis where you have some leases roll over, and you're capturing the same type of information in terms of, you know, capturing your rent and your reimbursements, et cetera. So you got your net rent here. It's $2 million the first year, $2,050,000 the second year, et cetera. Fairly straightforward. Let's add some tenant improvements. So you see it has the amount and then it has the allowance. For the owner analysis, the amount doesn't really matter because that's what the tenant has to pay. So from the owner's perspective, I just care about the allowance. That's the amount that I agreed to give the tenant. So even though the tenant may have to pay 20 per square foot, we're saying, well, you know, as part of you agreeing to sign this lease, we're going to give you an allowance of $10 per square foot. We'll pay for up to $10 per square foot of improvements, or basically give you the money to cover $10 per square foot of improvements when you sign the lease. So the $10 is all that matters here. Now, when we go to the tenant analysis, it's going to be important because the tenant's going to be concerned both about what they end up having to pay on that space, because they're maybe comparing different leases, seeing what's best for them. And so they want to know what they would have to pay compared to how much they're going to get as a reimbursement from the owner. So both the 20 and the 10 will matter for the tenant allowance, but for the owner analysis, it would only be the amount that the owner has to provide as an allowance that would matter. Okay, I mentioned that because I remember when I was first working with the program, it's like, well, why do we have both the 20 and the 10 there? You know, well, it matters for the lease analysis, which oftentimes is kind of the flip side of the same coin. What the owner gets, the tenant has to pay, but there will be differences in the way we would analyze the space depending on whether you're an owner and a tenant, because of things that the tenant has to pay that the owner doesn't have to worry about. So tenant may still have to pay some moving allowances, tenant may still have to pay some TIs, et cetera. Okay, Jeff, if any questions come in, yell out. Hopefully I'm going about the right pace here. So here we added in the improvements. You see that's a negative because that's something that, you know, we've got to pay $1 million to the tenant the first year to build out their space. So that is a negative, and then, you know, we have a bunch of positives, again, from an owner's perspective, what they're receiving, so what they have to pay out in the allowance. That was the $10 per square foot times the 100,000 square feet, and then you've got the amount you're actually going to receive in rent. Lease accounting analysis. So you may or may not have to worry about this, but most tenants, because of new accounting regulations, relatively new, it's been a couple years now, but those accountants are always making work for us, right? And they say that the lessee, the tenant, must show the lease on a balance sheet. So if you're a corporation leasing space, that lease affects your balance sheet. And you've got to show the lease as both an asset and a liability, as if you own the building or own the space that you're leasing. The idea is to allow people that are analyzing the company to basically recognize that, hey, that tenant has a liability to make those lease payments. That's not too different than if they owned the space and they had to make mortgage payments. So we want you to show that liability on the balance sheet, but we're also going to let you show the asset, which they call the right of use as an asset. In other words, your right to use that space for the next 5 or 10 or 20 years. They call that a right of use asset, which is basically the present value of the lease payments. Kind of makes sense. I've got a right to use that space. That has value. So that goes on your balance sheet. And then you have your liability on the balance sheet. And they're kind of the same to start off with. There's reasons they could be different, which we don't need to get into. The program figures all that stuff out, fortunately. Has to do with, whether the payments are certain or uncertain, as to whether they have to be included in the right of use asset and the lease liability. But both of them are amortized over the lease term. They're amortized at different rates. How they came up with this, you have to wonder, but the lease liability is based on, and it's a formula based on the actual rent that's being paid that lowers your lease liability over time. But the right of use asset is as if it was a straight line. In other words, it's not based on what you're actually paying, but it's based on taking the total rent and averaging it as if it was the same amount every year, and using that to amortize the asset. So kind of crazy, but you do have to do it. And when you do that calculation, you actually have to come up with a discount rate, which I would suggest is the same discount rate you need to think about when you're going to calculate that effective rent that I started to talk about, and we're going to come back to. So this is just what the accounting folks say, basically that you should come up with a discount rate that's recommended to be what the lessee would have to pay to borrow money, kind of keep it simple. So when we look at the program, you'll see something like this. You'll see the occupancy cost, both the total over the lease term as well as the present value based on whatever discount rate you did put in there. And then you'll see the average rent and then the effective rent. And then that will be on a per square foot basis, usable square feet, or you can change that to the rentable. And then your average and effective monthly rent, again, on a per square foot basis. And then on the right-hand side, you see your right of use asset and your lease liability that we just talked about. And we have had some users that said, boy, I'm glad you added that to the program, because we have a tenant that really cares about that. And they want to look at that in addition to the other things that matter when they're comparing different lease alternatives. So it does matter to some tenants. You can see at the bottom what the effect of the lease payments are over time. In this case, you see a slight increase in those blue bars when they're positive, and you see the TIs as a negative in that really the beginning of the first year. And then on the right, you see the balance sheet impact that we talked about, that right of use asset. They don't start off exactly the same, but they both decrease down to 0 by the time you get to the end of the lease, because you've amortized both the right of use asset and the lease liability. Net effective rent. So the idea, I talked about this a little already, the purpose is to compare leases on an apples to apples basis. What do I mean by that? Well, lease payments can have a lot of different patterns over time. You could have different amounts of tenant improvements at the start of the lease, and different patterns for the expense reimbursements, how they're kicking in. Does the tenant pay all the expenses right away, or some of the expenses right away, or is it just above a stop where they start off after the first year and then kick in? And how is the rent increasing over time? Is it level for a certain number of years and then it jumps up, or does it start to go up right away? So you have all these different lease patterns, and it's really impossible, at least for me, to look at all the different possibilities and say, okay, this is the one that's the least costly, or gives me the most rent from the owner's perspective. You really need to try to put all those on an apples to apples basis, and that's the idea of an effective rent calculation. What it does is, again, is convert those actual lease payments, including the TIs and moving allowances and anything else that's going on, into level payments as if it was just the same payment every year that has the same present value using your discount rate, the same present value as the original lease. So now we can compare them on an equal basis. So the program calculate that. You see here the net effective rent in this case is $1,858,631 per year. So that's the level rent that has the same present value as the actual lease payments. We'll see in a later example where you have different effective rents, and you can look at that as well as some other things to decide which one is best. Not that that's the only thing you look at. You know, the quality of the space could be different, and certainly other factors. And we're going to talk a little bit about that near the end, some of the other more subjective things you want to take into consideration. But I think you want to start with the numbers and then, you know, move on to the less quantitative things that matter. So this just adds the moving allowances, moving expenses. So you can see, oh, and commissions, you know, so take that into consideration. So all those kind of things can be factored into the program and in the effective rent calculation. So here's a tenant rep example. There's 3 proposals for the same space. The rentable square foot is 100,000, usable is 100,000, lease starts 7 July 2022, term of 60 months. Operating expenses in year 1 are $10 per square foot, increasing 3% per year. Again, we have no free rent. Tenant improvements though will be $7.50 per square foot, but we're going to have an allowance of $5 per square foot that's paid by the lessor. So all those things we've kept the same for each of the alternatives. They could differ, of course, for each of the alternatives. The lease term could differ, and tenant improvements could differ. But what I do have differing here that I listed at the bottom is the first one's going to be a net lease with a rent of $17 per square foot with no rent escalations. The second is a gross lease with rent at $25 per square foot, but it's going to be increasing by 4% per year. And the third is a base stop, using the first year expenses as the stop, but then with a rent of $24 per square foot, and then increasing 5% per year. So you're better than me if you can look at those 3 and tell me which one has the lowest overall net effective rent. Can you do that, Jeff? You're better than me, probably.
Not that quick, Jeff.
Not that quick. Okay. We'll wait for the new Accountant 2 movie to come out. If you saw the Accountant movie, you know that he could have looked at all those and told you exactly what the best alternative was before he went out and started killing a bunch of bad guys. Okay. Base stop lease. So we're just showing some of the details for one of the alternatives here with the base stop lease. So you can see your base rent has the $24 per square foot per year. You've got your escalations that we talked about. And then you can see the reimbursements kicking in there at the bottom, where you've got your base rent, your operating expenses. But again, that's your expense reimbursements. We should relabel that in the program, expense reimbursements, because again, that's what you're getting, not what you're paying. And then the improvements. And then remember, this is the tenant allowance. Okay, so tenant analysis. So the improvements in this case are the portion that you have to pay as a tenant. So that's why it's a positive number. These in this case, this is all what you have to pay. Okay, so you've got to pay the rent, obviously. You've got to pay the amount that's passed through to you, right? And then you've got to pay for the improvements that are not covered by the allowance. And that gives us our total occupancy cost at the bottom. And then again, you can put in the information for the operating expenses. So you've got your $750,000 that are improvements, but the allowance is 500,000. So you only had to pay the difference between the two. So the tenant has to pay the 250,000, which is what we saw in the previous screen. And then this is what it would look like for the base stop. You can see at the top there, after having put in all the information for those alternatives, you've got the net lease, you've got the gross lease, and you've got the base stop. So we're going to end up being able to compare those three. So you see what we talked about before with the summary of the lease information as well as your balance sheet implications of all this. It'll be more interesting when we try to compare all three alternatives, which we have here as some of the summary information for each lease. Probably what's more interesting is then to look at the actual cost for the tenant of each of these alternatives. So you got your total rent and you've got your average annual rent and all that. But I hopefully convince you that maybe what we really want to focus in on is that net effective rent, because that takes into consideration the timing of those rent payments. It may or may not be the one that has the lowest total rent. In this case, it looks like it is, but it may not always be the case. So you see your net effective rent is lowest, it turns out, on the gross lease alternative. That has the lowest cost to the tenant. So I guess we could say the tenant wants the gross lease, but the owner wants the net lease, right, in this case. And then we have what's interesting here is notice that the balance sheet implications, if the tenant cares, and some do, they're really different between the net lease and the gross lease. Because on the gross lease, because the owner has to pay the expenses, their lease payments are higher, right? And you don't know what the actual expenses are going to be, so they don't have to work that into the calculation of what affects the balance sheet. So if they go with the gross lease, they've got to put a bigger, 12 million rounded versus, slightly under 8 million on the balance sheet. So that makes a big difference if, again, the owner is sensitive to how this is going to impact their balance sheet, because that could affect some other loan covenants that they have. That could affect the way investors view the health of the company. A lot of different reasons why the tenant may care about how it impacts their balance sheet. So in that case, maybe they'd still be willing to, go with the net lease, even though it has a higher net effective rent. Or maybe they go back to the negotiating table, right, and say, okay, well, we want to go with the net lease, but you've got to get your effective rent down to, where it would be with the gross lease alternative. And that would be a pretty reasonable argument, right? It's look, you were willing to do something that had a net effective rent of $2,755,000, on your gross lease. You ought to be able to structure the net lease. And I've got this program that'll, tell me what you should be willing to do to get that effective down to at least the same number, and that's going to help me out on my balance sheet. So you can use this as a great negotiating tool as well as making your final decision. And you can create some real nice reports. We could have a whole webinar just on how to create reports, and we do. I'm sure Jeff hosts a number of those because there's just all kinds of different things you can do with creating nice reports. Just to give you a little sample here. So you go into the publish area, and a lot of different ways you can publish it, and email the reports or publish it on a website, whatever. But depending on the report you select to create and what all you pull into that report, you can have nice pictures of the property and the summary information, as well as the discount rates you used and the effective rent and the other rent calculations we talked about, and even the balance sheet stuff and so forth can all be on your report. So let's talk about just one more case study that you might do for a tenant rep analysis, which was based on an actual situation that we had with the client several years ago, changed the names to protect the innocent and all that. But we had a client whose lease was expiring, and they were trying to decide whether to renew the same space or lease some space in a different building. So they had several different things that they could do. They're negotiating with the existing owner, but also being enticed to move to space in a different building, different owners. And so, of course, they want to know, will they have some moving costs that they have to pay, or are they going to get, reimbursements for some of those, allowances for some of those? Are there differences in the tenant improvements and that they would have to pay to fix out the space? Of course, if they stay in their existing space, maybe they don't need any tenant improvements. So that could be a difference across the different leases. They're going to have some TIs if they have to move. So are they going to get reimbursed for those? Whereas they stay in their existing space, maybe it's what they already, it's already been fixed the way they need it. So they don't have the TIs. New building, of course, could be a different class, could be lower class, could be a better class. So that'd be one of the more subjective things to consider. So again, it's kind of hard to compare these leases with the different alternatives. Program really helps you do that. The key inputs we've already talked about, your start and end date, any tenant improvements, your upfront costs for moving, commissions, fees, deposits, etc. Rentable area that's used to calculate the rent. We know that can be different than your usable area, what the base rent is, any abatements, any steps, who pays the expenses. All that would go into the program. And then what we care about is our rent per square foot. And we want to be able to compare things on an apples to apples basis, which is where our net effective rent comes in handy. So, and we already talked about the financial statement considerations because of what the Financial Accounting Standards Board did to us as part of the GAAP accounting. So again, we're doing our comparative lease analysis. This was an office tenant rep analysis that I had done. And you see different alternatives here, the names, Tri-Staff Office Park, Oakhurst Office Park, Concord Building, Technology Offices, Campus Center Offices. Those were all the different alternatives. And then so for each of these, you'd have one of these reports. But more important is our comparative analysis. So for each of these, what's the total rent, what's the average annual rent and rent per square foot and the present values and the net effective rent and all that stuff, as well as the balance sheet stuff that we see at the bottom. So I kind of summarized it here. Maybe go back to this one though quickly. So let's see, which one has the lowest effective rent in this case? It looks like the Concord building, 212, 211, right? For the net effective rent. That's not the one though that has the lowest right of use asset and liability. Looks like that one is the Tri-Staff office building. I think that was their existing space. York, PA. That's where I was born. Forgot that this was in York, PA. What else here? Actually, I was born in Lancaster, but grandparents were in York, PA, and we always visited there. Anyway, you can see that we've got all the main things that we want to look at for each of these lease alternatives. And if you clicked on variance at the top there, it would then do the differences by subtracting everything from your main alternative to see how much it varies up or down from what you would have to pay on your main alternative. So this is a chart that you would get for each of those. So and there's several different charts you could choose from, but you see the chart selected here is your annual net effective rent. And you see what that is. Like I said, the Concord building had the lowest effective rent. And I made some notes here. Again, this was kind of based on an actual example. So Tri-Staff, you see I've noted, well, that's when we stay in the existing building. So there's no moving costs or TIs. But the rent's a little high. Might be, if you showed this to the existing owner, you say, look, why, you know, I'm willing to stay in your existing space, but you got to make it competitive with what I can do moving other places. And it also, you maybe wouldn't tell the owner this because you care that it's the least amount of liability that can be on the balance sheet. So that's something that you might be looking at, or helping your tenant if you're working on the tenant side. The Oakhurst office has the lower rent even after the TIs and moving costs, and it's a Class A building at a Class A plus location, but it has the greatest lease liability. So if again the owner cares about the lease liability, that's might be kind of a negative in that case. Then the next one is the lowest effective rent, but it's a Class B building, although it's at a B plus location. Then we have a Class B building, but at an A minus location, and then a Class B building at a B plus location. So, you know, a lot of different things in addition to the net effective rent that obviously ultimately matter. And Jeff, this is probably a good time for you to kind of talk about some of the other ways we can compare the leases in the tour guide that would kind of complement or supplement the analytics that you would have from the lease comparative analysis program.
Sure, Jeff, and that's important. You bring up some of the variables here, but clearly there are many that go into the decision. It's not all economics. Well, that's a major factor. It could be walkability, it could be bandwidth, it could be just image and other amenities or joint or adjacencies or other attributes that you have in our tour book. We have a transaction manager app that also works for landlord and agent tenant reps that have the ability to create all of the subjective rating categories and actually allow the tenant themselves to rate the spaces as they go on tours and evaluate different characteristics and spaces one against another and make notes so that you can create a score of each tour and each space on the subjective characteristics of the property, while this gives you the details on the financial side. You can bring it all together to say, well, you know, you're pretty close at, you know, Oakhurst Park and Technology Office, but the image at Technology Office is just a whole lot better, and you know, and it's easier for my employees to get to, and greater restaurants around for them to get to lunch at. So it's going to create a better quality of life and able to help us recruit more. So what, you know, all the factors that you would typically analyze, it just helps you sort of package it all into one neat set that facilitates the decision making.
All right. So as a conclusion, and we can see if there's any last minute questions that have come in here. We got some time. So it's hard to compare leases without considering all the factors that could impact the rents. So hopefully I've convinced you that having the effective rent calculation in the program is a good way to compare leases. Certainly not the only way, as both Jeff and I have talked about, but you know, if you've got a different effective rent, and whether you care about it being lower or higher depends on whether you're the owner or the tenant, but you know, you've got to have some other factors that offset that, because that, you know, I always think of the movie Jerry Maguire, show me the money, you know, so the effective rent is really capturing the, you know, show me the money part before you look at some of the more subjective things. Tenant, of course, might also be concerned about how the lease impacts their balance sheet. Not all tenants, but again, I know at least some of our users have really found that to be important in some of the tenants that we're working with, especially if you're working with corporate tenants. The RealNext lease comparison and analysis is a useful tool for all this analysis, but of course you can't remove judgment from the final decision, and that's where some of the things Jeff talked about can be helpful. Ultimately, you hear about some things like, you know, the spaces closest to where the asset manager lives that enter into this decision, but you know, we take you as far as we can with the analytics in the program. Okay.
Jeff, there is a question about are there presentations that don't include, or can you eliminate the accounting outputs? And there are.
When you select the reports, right, you can decide whether you want that or not. I'm pretty sure you can. That's a good question. I'll have to check and see. I'm pretty sure you can, because you can customize the reports, right, Jeff, to have about anything you want in them.
Well, the certain reports have certain data in that report, and you can't change that report. So that summary report does include the lease liability, but as Jeff mentioned, there are, I guess, 20 or so different reports, and they don't all include that. So you would just pick the reports that you want, and if you didn't want that, don't add the one that has that those two lines in it. So you'd be able to see it that way.
Yeah, if something like that's really important to a lot of the users, we could kind of put that on the roadmap, maybe as an option. You could check whether you want that to appear or not appear. If it's on a report that you really want to use for other purposes. We're always interested.
The other alternative is, again, in the transaction manager, there is what I could call a lighter version of the financial analysis. So in addition to the quality ratings of the space itself, it also gives you the net effective rent, and that's a simple cash flow type of model without all of the depth of assumptions that Jeff went through today in Market Edge. So if you need a lighter version without the accounting, you might just want to use that report. And so next. Question about the slide deck. Jeff, can we share the slide deck as well as the video? The recording will automatically come out. If you can share the deck, we will make that available to everyone as well.
Oh, if there's no other questions, we hope everybody has a happy holiday if you're celebrating it, and a nice weekend either way.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.